Okay, well, welcome back, class. So today we're going to continue building upon our university Java example, and we're going to focus this video on a concept called constructors. So, constructors, well, what are constructors? Constructors are a way that allows us to literally construct a new Java object. Okay, to construct a new Java object. So, let me tell you about a little bit about what that means, and we're going to look at a couple variations of it. Okay, so let's just kind of recap where we left off before we do that. So we've got these two Java classes, main and student. Here in main, we're basically creating two Java objects, Adam and Beth, and we've been using our setters here to say set the name of a student, where we set both the first and the last name, maybe the age, and so on. We can also use some methods that are within the class to assign some grades and maybe to display some information. And then down here, we're iterating through and we're basically dumping out information around the grades for a particular student. Okay. So let's expand on this, and I really focus the attention of this this video is particularly on this line here, at least as a starting point, where we look at this, where we see something called new student. Now, as I mentioned before, when we have this word new, notice the syntax highlighting here, how it's blue, right? So this tells us that it's a reserved word within Java. It's a reserved word where it means it's doing something special in the constructs of the language. And in fact, it actually allocates space for this object on the heap, right? We've mentioned that before. And notice here, when we look at this definition, where we have student and then we have open and close parentheses, a key thing to kind of remember and to point out is when we see parentheses like this, that's an indication that it's some sort of function. Okay, some sort of function. This is in a very large number of languages. We actually also saw that in C. It's the same thing in Java as well. Parentheses indicate function. So this looks like here we're saying new student and that we're calling some sort of function. Okay. Now, what that function is something called a constructor. And if I come over here back to the student class, we could see something that effectively what that function is something that looks like this. Okay? This is called a constructor. And the key thing with a constructor is that it's right now the way it's built, right, is this is there by default. So if I did not include this, which wasn't there just a moment ago, we saw that the code still compiled, it still executed, it was fine, there was no problems. And effectively, that's because every class is going to have what is referred to as a default constructor, okay, which effectively, notice there's nothing in here, there's nothing in the body, the code block here for this constructor, so there's not too much to look at, right? But effectively what happens is when this is called, we say new student, is we're going to go ahead and we're going to execute something here, right? Now we can see this. If I'm just going to put a simple, something a little simple in here to indicate that we're inside the constructor. And you know what? I'm even going to put a breakpoint in here. We're going to use the debugger, and we're going to see when this actually gets called. Okay. And let's trace this a little bit. I'll also put a breakpoint in the code here, right? So let's run this. I'm going to run it in debug mode. And what I'm really getting at is I want to just show when the constructor is being executed. So the first thing about understanding what a constructor is, why we use it, is just getting a feel for when it comes up, when it's called, and then we can look at how we can use it to do certain things. Okay, so we're heading in the direction of what makes it so powerful and important. And they're used all the time. Okay. So let's run this in debug mode here. Okay, so we're at this line here, and I'm going to go and I'm just going to step over, right? We're going to hit the breakpoint in the student class in the constructor. So let me step forward, and notice now on that line we're here in the constructor. Okay. So we see the constructor is being called here And if I keep going, we keep kind of iterating through, I get down here creating another object, the object Beth, right? Now notice this is a different object. It's going to have to require creating new space. Notice the keyword new space in the heap, space to store all the data members, right, that belong to that object. And when this is called, like once again, we're going to hit this constructor, right? We're going to hit this constructor. Okay. So that gives you a sense of when constructors are called. Right now, let's get a better sense, and we know a little bit about what they're doing already, right? We know that we're using them in conjunction with this keyword new. So we know a little bit of information about what they're doing and the fact that constructors are being called when we're allocating space, when we're first allocating space for this object. Okay, remember we have to store information somewhere. We can't just have it exist and not store it anywhere, right? We're saying new, store that information on the heap, and this information here, right, space for all of that information is being allocated while the program's running at runtime, okay? And when that first happens, when we say new and allocating the space, this constructor is called, okay? So it's happening right when we're allocating space, right when we're first allocating space for all of this data members for a given object. Okay. All right. So it's a special function, right? We're seeing that now is that it's a special function. So why do we care, right? So a follow-up question would be like, why do we care and what might we want to use them for? Okay. Constructors tend to be used to set a lot of default values. So we're gonna initialize things. We're gonna have some default values. Now, some of this logic I already have up here, right? We're allocating space for grades for up to 10 grades, right? It's very common that you'll also see things that look like this, right? That's actually done, right? That's done in the constructor when it's first called and allocated, right? Same thing for even stuff like here. It could be done either way, okay? That's not so powerful seeing it that way because we've already been able to initialize it the way that we just showed it a moment ago, okay? However, what makes it more powerful and start to really see the reason why it's so commonly used is I can force a object to be constructed a certain way or to have some initial input values. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we never want to allow a student object to be created without having at least a first and last name. Okay, so like right now, right on line 16 here, right, if I create this student, if I did something like this, I'll just say first name, right? That's not defined, right? It's not defined yet. I haven't defined it till the next line after. So this doesn't really make any sense to do this, right? Doesn't make any sense because the name's not defined, right? It's really something you should never do, right? You should initialize that data, but I'm showing doing something incorrect so that we can work on fixing it, right? So here we can actually see that we get something that's saying name is null, right? Name is null because I'm reading it before we wrote to it. Okay, so constructors can prevent that from ever happening, right? That would never occur. That you would have to have some sort of valid name set prior to when you're first actually even creating the object. So let's look at how we could do that. All right, this is not the only constructor this is the default one, is a constructor that, by the way, just to really make very clear, notice the name of this function, the name of the constructor is the same name as the class, right? That's a rule, right? It has to be that way. That is how Java knows that this is indeed not just any function, that this is indeed the constructor, okay? The name has to match, okay? But there's nothing that prevents me from having different type of inputs that are coming in. Okay, I can define another constructor that, notice it has 2 input parameters instead of 0 as the default. Okay, and maybe I want to do the same thing. I want to initialize the space for grades and have num grades to be 0. But most importantly is I want to set, okay, I want to set the first and the last name to what's passed in as the input parameters. Now remember, right, when I use this dot, I'm referring to this current object. This current object, the one that we are calling. So if I said, right, if I'm referring to creating the object Atom, right, I'm referring to the data members that belong to that object. And so we have this constructor, and I can have multiple constructors. So what this is going to allow me to do right now is I could do this here, right, the way that we just did it before. But if I wanted to, I can actually get rid of this, the default constructor, right? And if there's any constructor defined that has, if there's any constructor that is defined in the class, that will basically override the default constructor. So that, for instance, we no longer will have this one available to us if we comment it out, because there's another way of constructing the object. Okay. So when I go here, right, now notice this is not going to compile. Right? That's by design. We actually, in this case, what I'm kind of getting at is sometimes you actually want that to be the case. You don't want to allow that to be created. And that's the only way I'm going to be able to, in a valid sense, create this object is by passing in information, right, to initialize it properly. Okay, and actually we could leave that in there. Okay, now there's no reason for me to call set name. It already has a name. Okay, I have to do the same thing down here. Okay. And now if I run this, right, we see it works fine, right? I was able to, on line 17 here, I was able to read the first name. Effectively, there's no way to create this object, right, now, right? There's no way to create it without having us send in this additional information. Okay, now, key thing from a design perspective, you often want that to be the case, right? You want to force the object to get created a certain way so that we're initializing certain kind of basic properties are initialized in a way that you want them to be initialized, right? This prevents basically having an object created that doesn't have some fundamental properties set the way that you want. And there's no reason you can't have multiple constructors, right? We showed how the example where if you had the default plus an additional one, right, you can give multiple pathways for creating an object. I could have another one, for instance, here. If I wanted that, also set the age. Okay. Also set the age, right? And in this case, this is totally valid the way I had it. I just did it a moment ago. That's totally fine. It would also be fine for me to do something like this, right? Right. Notice there's 2 different ways now in which we can create this object. We can create it with just the name, or we can have it with the name and the age, right? So there's multiple ways in which we can create it. It depends. What this is allowing you to do, right, is programming is more than just getting things to work, right? You want things done in a way, you want to remember that in the real world, right? And you're going to see this in very quickly, right? I mean, it doesn't take long. Even like your first class in doing this, you start to see quite a bit of this, that the logic starts to get messy very, very quick, right? You have a lot of code. You can have a, it can be confusing. You can have one problem in one location that's causing a problem somewhere else. You want to have some really good design and programming methodologies and procedures that you're doing that makes it much easier to keep the code organized, be able to find problems easily, and be able to make changes easily. That's what we're trying to do, right? And what this allows you is the constructor is a way in which you can provide some pathways for how to initialize things in an object in such a way that you are setting it up correctly, right? You're initializing it the way you want. You have the flexibility. If you wanted to have multiple ways of creating the object, you can. If you wanted only one way that's valid to create it, you can do that, right? It allows the programmer to do what makes sense and to basically restrict things that shouldn't be allowed, right? If you don't want to allow certain things to happen, right, you can prevent, for instance, in this case, as we saw a moment ago, by not having a constructor with no inputs, we're preventing ever creating a student that doesn't have a name. All right, we could have that be our rule, right? If a student exists, the name must be set. Okay, and you could have all sorts of additional logic in here in terms of making sure that the name's not blank or whatever you wanted to do. Okay, but it's a very powerful tool and is really commonly used. Okay. All right, I'm going to keep that video short because I wanted to keep it focused just on the basics of constructors, okay? And what we will do is we will follow up on this, right? When you're going to get some practice doing it, and then we will go from there. And I'm going to go pet my dog because I hear him barking and being a crazy man. So, all right, take care. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, everyone, and I will talk to you soon.